Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jackie. I'm here with Pacific Northwest Publishing today with Jason Burrow-Sánchez, the author of the ADAPT book. I won't keep you long, but before we let Jason get started, I've got a couple quick details to review. If you have questions about the content along the way, you can submit them in the Q&A box on the right side of your screen at any time. Jason will take a couple minutes at the end of the webinar to address those questions. If you're having trouble finding the Q&A box on a PC, it's going to be in the upper right corner of your screen. There's some icons, and you're looking for the one with the question mark. If you're on a Mac, you're looking in the bottom right corner of your screen, and it's a tiny little set of icons. If you have technical issues, please send a message either in the Q&A box or the chat box to me as the host, and I'll see what I can do to help get you untangled and underway. You might experience trouble with the audio connection if a large group of users at your school or maybe in a computer lab all jump online at once. If that ends up being the case, we can send you the call-in information to access the audio broadcast over the phone. As always, we're going to record today's webinar, and we'll email the link out to view the recording in a couple days. So if you run into too much trouble today, know that we can still get you this content. All that said, I'm going to turn things over to Jason and let him introduce Advanced Decision Making and Problem Solving for Teens, the ADAPT program.
Thank you, Jackie. I appreciate it. Hi, everybody out there. This is Jason Burrow-Sánchez. I'm going to take, thank you for spending some of your time with me today. I'm going to talk about the ADAPT program, Advancing Decision Making and Problem Solving for Teens, which is published through Pacific Northwest Publishing. Basically give you some background on the program, what it's used for, what we've used it for, and essentially what it looks like. We only have an hour or so to talk, so I won't be able to get into too much detail. But at the end is my contact information. You always have the opportunity to email me and follow up with me if you have more specific questions if we're not able to get to them today, but I will save a little bit of time at the end to do that. So again, thank you for being with me. I appreciate that and appreciate your time out of your I know it's a busy schedule. So in terms of the ADAPT program, just putting it in a larger perspective, for where it belongs, it really belongs in terms of our, you can either call it response to intervention or levels of prevention, intervention triangle, however you kind of conceptualize it, but it's really a secondary, a tier 2 intervention. And so really for youth at risk for certain things, for problem behavior, for substance use, for anger issues, for negative mood issues, and so forth, and we'll talk about some of those as we go. And that's really how we look at it. So it is also a small group-based intervention, and I'll talk about that as we kind of go along today. But just to give you an overall kind of idea contextually of where it kind of belongs in the hierarchy of interventions per se. But I also wanted to give you some background in terms of how I think about the intervention and how we conceptualize it as a whole in terms of what's the rationale for it, where it comes from, and so on and so forth. So basically, when I talk about ADAPT, part of the way that I really look at things is through a stress and problem-solving model. So this the example that you have on this page here may be an adolescent that you worked with, and the idea is that there's a lot of things impinging upon the adolescent that are stressful. It could be, as we know, adolescents may be involved with substances, they may have a depressed mood, they may have anger issues, so on and so forth. And all adolescents experience things like this, but the broader issue is how do they deal with it in terms of how do they manage stress, how do they problem solve, and so forth. Well, we do know that one of the ways to do that is to see if there's various options for problem solving and finding ways to deal with that. Unfortunately, a certain percentage of adolescents will have a hard time doing that. Either they won't be able to see the options, or they'll see as too many options, or they'll feel like they're limited options, which will continue on with the problem, whatever that problem may be. The thing is, in my experience in working with adolescents and teens, many times I find that they find themselves in problematic situations or stuck when they can't find alternative solutions to things. So for example, they only feel like they can do one thing or another, but they can't really see a range of opportunity or a range of possible solutions to potential problems. And one of the goals, one of the things we really try to teach and adapt is that problems are challenges and they're not necessarily threats. Many times, my experience has shown that when working with adolescents, when they find themselves stuck, they tend to see problems as threats, not necessarily challenges. Now, as a behavior interventionist, right, or a psychosocial behavior interventionist, whatever you want to call me, basically, you can, the problem with is if adolescents don't learn any problem management skills or problem-solving skills, the problems tend to repeat themselves, and they don't tend to get better. However, as an interventionist, one of the things we can provide is skill sets to adolescents in which to improve their problem-solving strategies, right, kind of rational problem-solving strategies, which is what I'll be talking about, and hopefully resolve the problem, which is what we want to do. Now, I'm trained as a psychologist, and that's what I do, basically. You know, I don't provide medications. You know, I don't do brain surgery, anything like that. But what I have to really provide are psychosocial interventions or tool sets for adolescents to utilize in order to improve their problem solving. The other way, so that's kind of a stress and a problem solving model, or one way to look at it. And really ADAPT kind of falls on that upper line in terms of giving adolescents tool sets in which to deal with things. The other way I like to look at it, though, is from a biological perspective. One of the things that neuroscience has done within the past couple decades is really shown us that adolescent brains, or basically people's brains, don't fully develop until they're in their mid-20s. So in the last part of the brain to develop, it's what's called the prefrontal cortex, which is that front part of the brain, which you can see the word where it says judgment, and it's kind of a purplish color. Kind of that area of the brain in terms of making decisions, right? Planful decision-making, consequential thinking, executive functioning, all those things that are really important for weighing options, or being able to say, hey, I may want to wait on this and do something later, as opposed to just doing the most impulsive thing that comes to mind. So that part of the brain, we know, isn't fully developed until a person's mid-20s. But as I said, as a psychologist, as an interventionist, knowing that is helpful. But that's not where I intervene per se, because I can't go in and perform brain surgery. But what I can do is provide, let me go back to my other slides, and provide skill sets to help adolescents problem solve. But I like to show the biology as well, because I think that's really important, because it does indicate that rational problem solving, or problem solving in general, is one of the areas that adolescents absolutely need to develop across time. Okay. Sorry, my mouse seems to be stuck, but hang on one sec, just bear with me. There we go. Okay, so it just shows you, my ability to problem solve there. So anyway, so what is ADAPT? ADAPT is a small group intervention. It's based on cognitive behavioral skills and strategies. We have there's two ways you can think about it in terms of what the skill sets are that we teach. One is the foundational skills in terms of problem solving or rational problem solving and decision making, and I'm going to go into those more today than I will the other skill sets and give you an idea of what they look like. The other skill sets we talk about and we teach are we call them specific skill sets, and they're skill sets specific to adolescents, right? All things that adolescents are going to experience, like anger management, depressed mood. We don't say we talk about it as negative mood rather than depressed mood, just because some of the language with adolescents, they don't always talk about it as depressed mood. But anyway, substance use and abuse, communication skills, social support are some of the specific skill sets that we cover in the intervention. Going back up to the foundational skill sets, the idea here is that foundational skill sets are foundational or very functional skill sets, things that are going to help adolescents make good decisions, but are also going to generalize into a lot of other things. One of the examples one of the questions that I get a lot is, well, why do you teach these specific skill sets, problem solving or decision making? Shouldn't adolescents just pick up on that? Well, one, we know that biologically, if your brain's not fully developed, it may not be the case. Now, of course, there's individual variability, and some adolescents who are 15 will be better problem solvers than people who are 25, of course, but in general, not so. The other thing is, thinking about foundational skill sets in problem solving and decision making, these aren't skill sets that are necessarily explicitly taught in school settings. For example, in a math class, you may be taught implicitly how to solve for X, but how do you solve for X, or how does that generalize when someone offers you substances at a party, or someone offers you marijuana at a party? How do you generalize that? What does that look like? And so that's why we teach those foundational skill sets, so they can be skill sets and basically functional skills that adolescents can then generalize to other things, including our specific skill sets, the one we teach in the intervention, which again are some of the things I show you in the latter part of that slide. How is ADAPT delivered? It's a small group format, usually 6 to 10 members, 1 to 2 facilitators. I know that time, staff, personnel, and resources are always in short supply in school settings. So if you have more than one facilitator, that's great. You can have more than one if you have the capacity to do that. We've done it all different ways, but mostly we've done it in small groups with 1 or 2 facilitators, 6 to 10 members. Frequency, 1 or 2 sessions a week. Part of the reason I give you ranges is it'll really depend on what you have access to in your setting, what the resources are in your setting. Duration, 45 to 90 minutes. We've done all of them. And the other thing I will say, if you're doing it in a school setting, I do suggest that, if possible, do it during school time, and as opposed to after school. After school tends to be a little bit harder in terms of getting people for attendance, and we tend to find that the longer amount of time between when the bell rings after school and when our group starts, the attendance tends to decrease, or it's harder to get students engaged. But in any case, if you have the option to do it during school, that's what we generally recommend. And we're also a stable location in school settings. So basically, we've done it in school settings where we are able to do it in the same room every week. And the good part about that is we're able to post things, ideas and methods and models that we use in the intervention so adolescents can see them to remind them of them, like the problem-solving model we use, which we call the 4 Ws and so forth. But also it provides consistency and stability to the location where you provide the intervention, which is always a good thing. Development and research, I always get asked about how it's developed and what have we done in terms of evaluation. So we've been working on the ADAPT project for probably about 10 years now. We started in 2007. We initially spent 2 years in a high school setting doing a randomized waitlist control study where we served about 80 kids, 80 youth, and we found that adolescents in that setting at the end of the intervention had significant increases in self-esteem, decreases in depressive symptoms, and overall positive rates of abstinence. We've also tested it in a community setting, in a 5-year community study, which was a slightly different version of it, and it was more of a treatment-based version, but we also found significant decreases in substance use. And more recently, in the past 2 years, and currently, we've been testing it in juvenile justice settings, more specifically community-based diversion programs. And what we have been testing is the first part of the model, the foundational skill sets, and basically sessions 1 through 5. And what we have found is that kids or youth in those settings have significantly improved the rational problem-solving skills, which is one of the things, obviously, that we want to see. And I can provide more of this information in detail. It's not what I'm going to focus on today. I'm going to focus on more of the intervention, but just to give you that background. So here's what ADAPT looks like in terms of all 12 sessions. So it is a 12-session-based intervention. As I've said before in a previous slide, it's broken up into two different components per se. One component is sessions 2 through 5, which is really the foundational skill sets. We talk about it in how do I solve problems. We have models for doing that. Why do things happen to me, et cetera, et cetera. And we're going to talk more about that in detail in a few slides. And then the specific skill sets, which are sessions 6 through 11. What are drugs? What do they do? How do I refuse drugs? How do I communicate better? How do I manage my anger, manage negative mood? How do I get the support that I need from others, and so forth. Okay, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time in the next few minutes talking about sessions 2 through 5. But before I do that, I just wanted to give you some overall structure. So if you do have a copy of the book, actually, hang on one sec. Oops. Okay, it looks like, So one of the slides I had in here isn't in here anymore, so, but that's okay. What I was going to say is, if you have a copy of the book, the sessions are structured similarly across sessions 1 through 12, so they're pretty easy to follow. In terms of the session structure, at the first part of the session, there's session information, which includes the session goals or the reasons why you're doing the session, as well as preparation materials and things that you'll need to carry it out. There's also a session outline in the middle part, and there's also a sample session, which is more explicit instruction about how to do that, including various scripts and so forth that you can use. Of course, you know, the goal is to become more fluent in the intervention as you use it. So the scripts are just really to help you, prompt you, but I would suggest that always, the more you can take examples from the students you work with and the groups that you run, the better, because that makes it more relevant to the students you're going to work with in those settings. Okay, so let's dive in a little bit and see what some of this looks like. So one of the second session, or one of the first kind of skill sets that we work on is how do I solve problems? What does problem solving look like? And the first thing we do is talk about how do you describe, you know, what is the problem? How do you describe it? Well, problems can be a range of things, right? They can be anything from what color shirt am I going to wear in the morning to, you know, I just got in a beef with one of my teachers, and what am I going to do about that? What we usually find is that initially youth have some difficulty describing what the problem is or making it more explicit, but that's one of the things we work on. The other thing is, and I talked about this at the beginning, is what are your options to solve the problem? As I said before, in my experience, I found that when students and youth feel themselves getting stuck, many times it's because they don't have the opportunity, or they don't have the skill sets yet. Well, they probably have the opportunity, but they don't have the skill sets yet to generate potential solutions to problems. And even if they aren't solutions that they may necessarily take, but there's a solution that may possibly work. My experience working with youth has indicated that typically, again, when they find themselves stuck, they find themselves narrowed into a corner where they feel like there's only a couple things they can do. So every time someone makes them angry, the only thing they can go to is hitting someone else, right? As opposed to other ways to kind of avoid conflict and so forth. Well, the way we work in terms of ADAPT is try to point those things out, but also give the students an opportunity to realize there may be other options available to solve the problems. One of the key skill sets that we use is brainstorming. It's not anything magic. Brainstorming's been around for quite a long time. And the idea really is just to get adolescents opportunities to look at various solutions to problems that are out there, right? It doesn't mean they have to take them, but it does indicate that they have the opportunity to think about what they look like. Especially working in small group settings, one of the things I talk about is the power of the group. And the power of the group is important in part because you have the opportunity for adolescents to hear peers say things, right? And what I found is that, and actually what the research suggests, is that when peers say things, they can be just if not more powerful than when an adult does it. Okay, so in terms of, I've worked with a lot of adolescents who've been involved in juvenile justice. One of the problems that they've come across is having a dirty urine analysis, and then what happens with that? Dirty meaning it came out positive for a particular drug, and then what do they do that? What are the options in terms of what are the solutions? Well, I could run away or go AWOL, right? I could void my PO, various things, but the opportunity is there to do a lot more than just probably a couple of the solutions that they come up with. And if we go back to the slide with the adolescent brain, one of the things we know with the adolescent brain is what tends to be more fully intact during adolescence is the impulsivity part of the brain. So thinking about only a few solutions and not a lot actually makes a lot of sense from an adolescent perspective. So what our job is to increase that, right, or to provide them ways to brainstorm more alternatives. And even if they're ones that they don't necessarily choose, but the fact that they have more opportunities to look at and more alternatives to look at provides the opportunity that they may make a better decision, okay? So the other thing we do with the how do I solve problems is also, you know, what solution did you choose and how did it work and so forth. We affectionately call this the 4 Ws. This slide actually shows kind of what it looks like on one of the sheets we have in the book. But we explicitly talk about what is the problem, how do you recognize that it exists, what are your options to solve it, what solution did you choose and what worked. We go through these things in the group environment, so adolescents have the opportunity to not only see what themselves but their peers do in terms of this. When I work with adolescents, I tend to be very visual. They are too. In my experience, at least, I tend to, if the opportunity presents itself, I'll have a whiteboard or some type of visual so we can write these things on the board. So when options come up to solve potential problems and so forth, we can write these things up and basically model a brainstorming activity where we provide the opportunity to come up with a number of different solutions before we even evaluate them, whether we think those things are going to work or not. Generally, it's helpful to come up with a potential problem that relates to the majority of adolescents in the group, if possible. But the idea, again, the main thing here is to help adolescents understand that there's opportunities and ways to solve things. And again, to show them that basically problems are not threats per se, but they're challenges. They're challenges and things we need to solve. Okay. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time more than that going over the problem-solving one because I wanted to get to a couple of the other sessions as well. The next session, session 3, is actually called Why Do Things Happen to Me? And we affectionately call this one Decision-Making Chains. And it actually comes out of the substance use literature as a background. And really, it's originally it's called seemingly irrelevant decisions. And the idea is that small decisions can lead to big outcomes. Okay, and those seemingly small or irrelevant decisions that we made can really lead to kind of outcomes that can affect us in the long run. The example that I'm going to show you is an actual example of a youth that I worked with in one of our groups. And basically, with this particular youth, one day he was at group, but he wasn't at group the week before. And the question was, why? What happened to you the week before? Why weren't you there? Well, he ended up telling me in group that he ended up getting suspended. I said, well, that's unfortunate because we wanted you in the group and so on and so forth. We missed you and so forth. And I said, well, tell me why you got suspended. What happened? How did that happen? And he said to me, he said, it just happened. I just got suspended. And really, he was, from what I could tell, he was being honest. And if you work with adolescents or if you have your own adolescents, the idea is the thought process may not always be very logical, may not always be very in-depth. But if you've ever worked with an adolescent and you ask them, well, how did that happen? Like getting suspended or something else. And they just tell you, well, it just happened, with no real thought about it. This is kind of that example. I said, okay, well, we can work with that. So I put up on the whiteboard, I said, it just happened, okay. And again, working with adolescents, I'm not trying to throw blame or judgment. It's really not about that. It's really about, from my perspective, it's really about teaching skills and building skills. And so I said, well, being suspended, and this is in a group setting, I'm curious about what happened right before you got suspended. And so we had that on the board, we worked backwards, and he said, well, I was in an argument, it was at school, I was in an argument, I was by the bathroom, and this is also an example we use in the book too, so if you've read the book, it may sound familiar. But it was an argument that I saw some other kid I didn't like, and I saw him by the bathroom, and I said something to him, and basically one thing led to another, and a teacher walked by, and then the teacher basically busted me for whatever reason, and I got sent to the vice principal's office, and I got suspended. I go, okay, all right. Well, again, I'm not trying to cast blame or anything, but just trying to really understand the situation, and I said, well, what happened before that? And he said, well, I was in the hallway walking around, and so forth. And then he said, well, and then I saw the kid by the bathroom. I knew it was a kid I didn't like, but I said something to him anyway. And the teacher walked by, I got busted, and then I got suspended, et cetera. I said, okay. Again, just trying to understand the particular situation. I said, so you were in the hallway. So I said, well, it must have been, a time when it's during a passing period or an open time or something. He said, no. He said, actually, I got bored in class. So I got bored in class. I left to say I needed to use the restroom, or I don't remember what his exact excuse was to the teacher, but he found himself in the hallway. He got in an argument with a kid he saw by the bathroom, and then he got suspended. And I said, wow. So there were actually quite a few things that happened, before you ended up getting suspended. And what we worked with here is, suspension is the problem, of course. And I said, well, one of the things that, that I think about is, who would have thought that being bored in class, right, and then your decision of asking to leave class or using a hallway pass or whatever would lead to you getting suspended? And when I said that in group, a lot of the youth looked at me and said, yeah, we probably wouldn't think about that. And I go, but it's a chain, as you can see, and it's things that happen. I go, has this ever happened before? And he said, yeah, it has. And what I said is, well, if your goal is to get suspended, right, then you know what to do. You know how to make that happen. And I said, but if your goal is to do something else, then what's the alternative strategies? What's the alternative to getting suspended if that's not what you want to have happen? Now, my experience is most adolescents at first, they may say, for example, tough adolescents, they may say, oh, well, I want to get suspended, not a problem. But if you really ask them about it, and if you're really working in a peer group situation, there's going to be some acknowledgement that getting suspended is typically not the best thing. And even if I'm not saying, here are some alternatives, what would be the alternative? And if adolescents are a little resistant to looking at the alternatives, partly what I'll say is, well, just imagine, right? Just to give them a little bit of a challenge and say, just imagine if you were to do something different in this situation, what would that look like? And so we talked about it, and one of the areas that would look different is, well, when I was in the hallway, and instead of, I saw the kid, I saw this other youth that I didn't like, and so on and so forth. Instead of saying anything to him, I could have gone back to class, right? And then if I had gone back to class, I could have done my classwork, whatever, and then perhaps things would have worked out, and I would have stayed at school and not getting suspended. I said, well, what happened when you got suspended? Well, he said, my mom got on my case, vice principal got on my case, the teacher got on my case, and so on and so forth. A lot of things happened. But the goal here was to show also not only what that chain was, but also what the alternatives were to that chain. We also talked about that the closer, right, in the chain across the top, the closer it gets to the problem behavior, the harder it is to alter that behavior. So the closer it gets, quote, to the red color there, the harder it is to make different decisions around that. It's easier to make different decisions when you're bored in class and you're in the hallway than it is when you're engaged in an argument with someone else and you feel emotional about it and so on, okay? And that's part of what we talked about. But importantly, one of the strategies, again, when I started at the beginning, one of the strategies is to work with adolescents to show them that there's more alternatives probably than what they thought about. So for this example, where the youth told me, well, it just happened, clearly, it didn't just happen per se, and I didn't say that. But we just worked backwards through the chain, and that's why we call them decision-making chains, because there's little decisions that happen at every step of the way that can lead to big outcomes. We just worked back through the decision-making chain, kind of found out what the antecedents were, but then thought about what are the alternatives in order to do something different. Okay. So that's session 2. So again, just as kind of a recap, I'm not going to go back through all the slides, but that's basically, that's session 3. So the first session is really the introduction session. The second session is really about problem solving, studying the basis or the foundation for problem solving. And then the third session is about decision-making chains, right? Kind of separating those things out and thinking about what are things that lead to other things and how do those decisions influence what happens in terms of what I do. And actually, this is just an example of one of the sheets in the book in terms of decision-making chains and what it actually looks like. It's pretty similar to what I showed you on the slide. We have a number of reproducibles in the book that students use both in the course of the session itself in the small group, and also that they can take home with them. And I'll explain a little bit more about the take-home pieces in a bit. The other thing in terms of the way we build on the foundational skill sets is with sessions 4 and sessions 5. So problem solving kind of starts from our most basic base level, then building up to decision-making chains, and now getting even a little more concrete, but a little more complex, perhaps, with mapping problem behaviors. And if just looking at this diagram, you know, probably what it's suggesting to you, this is basically a functional assessment. We don't call it functional assessment. All the things that we do have been, quote, translated for adolescents, or adapted, no pun intended, adapted for adolescents. It's called mapping problem behaviors because that's what makes sense to adolescents in our work with adolescents. For example, and also what I said before, in terms of the decision-making chains, we call them decision-making chains because that's what's made sense for adolescents. So the examples that we use, the things that we do, have all been tested with adolescents, and really what we do is try to make sure the intervention makes sense for the youth that we work with, okay? But sessions 4 and sessions 5 build on each other, and we teach them sequentially, meaning starting with session 2, which is problem solving, running session, or going on to session 3, which is decision making, and then session 4 and session 5, because they all build on each other. So I would move sequentially that way in terms of the sessions, at least in the foundational skill sets, because that's also one of the questions I get. But really what we're doing here is trying to understand the relationships and really the function, even though I don't say that perhaps, the function and the reasons why people engage in certain behaviors. The next example that I'm going to give you is also one that's in the book, but also one that's a real example from a student we worked with. So this particular behavior was asking about a particular problem behavior or something that was occurring, and with this adolescent, it was around smoking marijuana. It was a behavior that he acknowledged that it was something that wasn't working out for him necessarily. Smoking marijuana. And so part of our goal here is, again, not to cast blame or judgment, but it's really to understand this behavior and understand what are the things that come before it, what are the things that come after it. And also, as we talk about these things, as I said, like in decision-making chains and so forth, these are things that I would map on the whiteboard, put up so adolescents can see, so our whole group can see as we work through them, okay? And so one of the things after we'd established what the problem behavior was, we also asked then what are some of the things that come before it, right? So more technically we might call these things antecedents. We just call them triggers or things that come before it. And what we found was that they are things that we call outside and inside triggers. Outside are basically outside the person per se. That's one way to think about it. They don't necessarily have to be outside in terms of outside a building, but just outside the person. So we typically found, what we found with this particular adolescent, he described that when he tended to smoke marijuana, it tended to be with friends, it was after school and before his mom gets home, right? And this is not a unique situation by any means, and there was other adolescents in the group who resonated with this as well. And also, what was going on inside? You know, and basically what's going on inside your body. I've worked a lot with adolescent males. You know, I use words like emotions and feelings. No, I don't use them all the time, perhaps, because some adolescent males may not respond to them. So I try to make it very concrete in terms of, you know, what does it feel like inside your body? Did you feel stressed? Did you feel mad? What does that feel like? I use myself as an example. When I say when I'm angry, what does that feel like for me? What does it feel like, you know, in terms of my own bodily reaction? Do I get, when I'm stressed, do my shoulders tighten up? Do I feel something in my stomach? And so on and so forth. Well, this particular adolescent said he felt stressed, he felt mad, and the reason was because he had gotten in an argument with one of his teachers before school ended that day. And the argument was around not completing an assignment. And the teacher gave him some feedback, which, you know, he didn't agree with, and he felt mad, he felt stressed. Again, this is not an atypical kind of situation here. But also we talked about what are some of the things that happen afterwards, right? And we talk about them in terms of good and bad consequences. You can call them positive or negative, it doesn't really matter. But we talk about what are basically the good consequences in terms of what happened after smoking marijuana is that he felt better and he wasn't stressed or mad anymore, which is pretty clear. I mean, marijuana absolutely has that effect, right? But you have to acknowledge reasons why people do things, but also acknowledging reasons, some of the bad things that can occur as well. So when we looked at that, he did agree that Afterwards, he got in an argument with his mom. When he came home, his mom was able to smell it on him. He had made a commitment to his mom not to smoke anymore, and obviously that didn't work out. He was grounded. He spent some money that he didn't want to because he was saving up to buy a skateboard, basically. He ended up spending money on marijuana. He forgot to do his homework. The teacher was upset with him, so it kind of the next day, it didn't make things any better because he was kind of in the same place with his teacher before, okay? But really kind of showing both the good things and the bad things that occur. And again, good or bad, it's not by my version of what's good or bad, it's by how the adolescents see it, right? But really what we're going for is the function of the behavior, right? And again, I'm not going to necessarily say that with the adolescents, but really what we're going for is the reasons why adolescents engage in specific behaviors. So if you look at the circles or the ellipses that I have there, the big reason why was to change the way this youth felt, right? So it's pretty clear that the triggers were before he felt stressed and he felt mad, and the afterwards, one of the consequences were he felt better and he wasn't stressed or mad anymore, right? So it took it away. It's kind of a negative reinforcement paradigm, right? You're taking away the things that you don't like, essentially, through a specific behavior. Well, the problem with that, though, in terms of why it's a problem behavior, is it wasn't producing the outcomes that this particular youth wanted, right? In terms of it was producing a lot more bad consequences than good consequences. And that was problematic. So in addition, whenever you have any type of problem behavior, you can't just take something away without putting something in its place. So then we talked about, which is actually the next session in terms of mapping alternate behaviors, or what are things you can do in those situations. So if we get back to the previous slide here, if I can go back. If we go back to the previous slide here, just to kind of set this up, what I would usually do on the board is have this particular picture on top and then write this one underneath it and then fill it out as we go along, okay? So in mapping alternative behaviors or mapping replacement behaviors, one of the things we want to know is what are opportunities, what are behaviors that could be engaged in that could basically serve the same function as the behavior that we were just talking about, or the problem behavior that we were just talking about. Well, you know, sometimes you'd say, well, that never happens, and I always engage in this particular behavior, smoking marijuana. You know, and we work with that, and we say, well, is there any times when smoking marijuana wasn't the behavior you engaged in, but you did something differently? And a lot of times with youth, especially male youth, exercise or some type of sports activity tends to be one of those things that tends to be incompatible with drug use. And for this particular adolescent, it was. His was actually skateboarding. His alternative behavior was skateboarding. And we talked about how when he skateboarded, one of his things was he liked to learn, you know, new tricks and get better at it. And what he actually found when he was honest with himself, but it was much harder to skateboard when he was high. And he wasn't able to basically be as good of a skateboarder when he was high. Now, granted, I didn't know much about skateboarding. He taught us a lot about it and so forth, but I went with it because it was his behavior, of course. We looked at some of the triggers. Now, as you can see, it looks kind of similar to what the triggers were in the slide before. Skateboarding outside, you know, things that happen outside with his friends after school before mom gets home. Inside, he felt stressed and felt mad. So the setup was pretty similar. And we're looking for also, in terms of when we're running these functional assessments, and we're looking for the common case, basically, you know, when does this usually happen? But however, the difference here is we take a look at the good and, quote, the bad consequences. What we found is that when he tended to go skateboarding instead of smoking marijuana, and the setup was, the antecedent was that he felt mad, he felt stressed, the good consequences tend to be a little bit different, right? In terms of he did feel better, he wasn't stressed or mad anymore, he learned a new trick on the skateboard, he had a good time with friends, he finished his homework, and mom was happy. Now the reality is, you even when you talk about good consequences here, there are more of them than there are in the previous slide. You also have to acknowledge the bad consequences, right? And these were from him. He got tired afterwards and he skinned his knee. Yeah, which is, you know, consequences of just kind of exercise in general. But what we were really trying to show here, and if you look at the ellipses again, was that there was an alternative behavior that basically served the same purpose as the marijuana. So again, this is a more detailed way to structurally kind of diagram, right, do an assessment, structurally try to diagram that the adolescent or the youth has more options than they may initially think they have. So that their only option when they feel stressed or mad isn't just smoking marijuana, but it may be that they have other things that they can do. And of course, you know, we build on the things that we've taught in the problem-solving session 2 and the problem-solving session to think about to generate solutions. So skateboarding might not be the only thing. So, you know, I live in Utah, so when it's snowing outside in a snowstorm, maybe skateboarding isn't the go-to. Maybe there's a bunch of other things. So that's one of the other things we would do in terms of the intervention is work with adolescents to make sure that they have a lot of alternatives and there isn't just one. Okay, so what I've shown you briefly, and I know I've probably likely skipped over a lot of things in part because time is short, is kind of 4 sessions roughly that we have, but sessions 4 and 5 kind of go together. But I've showed you the problem-solving session, I've showed you the decision-making session, and also our mapping sessions, which is basically why do I engage in these certain behaviors. The other things I want to do to kind of help round out the intervention a bit, because I'm basically just trying to give you an overview of the intervention today, is also to talk about what we call practice sheets. A large part of what we do in session is also practice skills. Now, when I lecture on this stuff, when I present this stuff, I don't call it role play, and the reason I don't call it role play is because when I call things role play, regardless if it's adolescents or adults, everyone basically kind of disengages with eye contact because they don't want to do a role play. So I call them practice skills, but related to the practice skills, we also have practice sheets, right? Because you can role play or practice skills in session, which is actually very helpful. But the other thing is the opportunity to practice skill sets outside of session. And we know from, you know, the research literature and so forth, especially the CBT-based literature, the more that you have the opportunity to practice things outside of session, the better the acquisition of skills. Now, we call these things practice sheets, and every session has a practice sheet that goes along with it, and what it does is it ties the skill set, or the practice sheet, yes, ties the skill set to the session just covered, and then it also ties it into the next session you're going to cover, so they link them together. We specifically don't call these things homework, and we don't because many times the youth that we've worked with have a negative connotation with homework, and it may be something that they failed at or not done as well at. But we call them practice sheets because these are things that all youth can practice. We don't grade them per se. They don't get an A or an F on them. But we just talk about it as a behavior that you can practice. Really, and again, the purpose of the practice sheets, by and large, is to practice skills outside of sessions. It also provides the opportunity for the facilitator, the expectation the importance is that all adolescents are expected to engage in skill practice, and we have ways that we work with that. But really, one of the important parts is to generalize skills across sessions, okay? We typically tend to find that practice does lead to better outcomes, but it allows you as a facilitator also to address the strengths and the weaknesses of skill practice. You know, some things we run into with youth that we worked with in terms maybe reading level. So it may be that even though they don't return their practice sheets, you know, the first thing we jump to is not that they're just being resistant, but it may be a reading issue. And if it is, that's again something we can work with in terms of our work with adolescents, but still basically integrating them into the intervention. But essentially, practice sheets allows us recurring activity and links one thing to the next. We have things in the book where we talk about rates of return and how we give feedback about that as well, and there's a lot of different options for doing that, a lot of different scenarios that we've run into. The other thing that I want to talk about, just kind of briefly, is monitoring progress and outcomes, because those are likely things that you have to do in your settings. Within the book, at the end of the book, there's a CD that comes with it, and on that CD, there's a lot of different forms that we've developed for your use. For example, we have Excel sheets where you can easily track attendance data and practice sheet data, so how often kids are attending, and it'll easily, if I move to the next slide, it'll easily graph it for you. So essentially all you have to do is put in the attendance data, and you can easily see who or what your attendance looks like by session. So if you have certain sessions where attendance is lower than not, you can make some decisions about what to do about that. Also going back to this slide, practice sheets, the same thing, because one of the things we talk about in the practice sheets is the rate of return. So if you also have Excel sheets within that in terms of to know who's completing the practice sheets, what are the rate of return like for your group, but more importantly, how do you problem solve that, right? So you know, people ask me, well, what is a decent rate of return? You know, 70–80% is probably pretty good in terms of rate of return. Will it be that high at the beginning? Absolutely not. But the way you get it higher is you problem solve it and work with the adolescents to do that. And there's a lot of different ways to do that. The other thing that I want to point out in terms of the CD, we also have our satisfaction surveys, because if you're working in school settings, you know, one of the things we found is always to engage as many people as you can in the intervention, and what I call direct consumers and indirect consumers. So direct consumers I usually consider the youth we're working with. Indirect consumers are the staff in the school, can be the administration, it could be the parents of the youth we're working with and so forth, or the teachers as well. And so one of the things we do with satisfaction surveys is they are actually on the disc and you can easily tailor them to your own needs, but they're 5-question satisfaction surveys that you can provide to teachers, parents, administrators, etc., and also the youth. And really it's just asking them about the program. It's kind of social validity data, asking them how they see the program, but really more importantly, trying to engage them in the program and getting information from them. Because a lot of times we do interventions or programming in schools, but we don't necessarily always ask our direct or indirect consumers what they think about it. And many times we found our work in schools is that we can usually head problems off better when we ask about them ahead of time and then when we address them afterwards. We don't let things go on and become bigger problems than what they really need to be. The other question I get asked is about outcome measures. There's a lot of different outcome measures that you can use. It really depends on some of the things you're trying to measure. If you're trying to measure, you know, depressive symptoms, if you're trying to measure self-esteem, if you're trying to measure rational problem solving and so forth. You know, if you have those types of questions, I probably email me. I'm happy to help answer some of those things, which I could do. But it really is kind of specific and related to some of the things that you're actually trying to get at. Okay, so I'll go through those. Kind of one of the last things I wanted to talk about today was one of the other things we have on the disc is the certificate of participation. And this certificate that we use, of course, you can adapt it to meet your own needs, for example. But we've done work in schools where we've done credit recovery or credit makeup, or provide credit, or the schools provided credit for students basically engaging in the intervention itself. And this certificate, as you can see, is just for completion of the number of sessions. It's not an evaluation of how well they did or a grade or anything like that, but it's just the completion of how many times they attended sessions, and you know and essentially what that looks like. So really, it's a certificate of participation, but it's a way to engage adolescents in the intervention. What I didn't really get a chance to talk about today, because we just don't have enough time, is really kind of the life cycle of what a group looks like. Because really, when you're doing small group interventions, you really have a couple things that you're working with. One is just kind of the group management aspect of it and what that looks like in terms of managing a group of adolescents. And the other part of that is also delivering whatever intervention it is that you're trying to deliver. So whether it be ADAPT or some other intervention. And generally, I find that we do our best work when those two things become integrated. I usually spend, you know, when I have more time, I usually spend more time talking about those components. But I just unfortunately don't have a lot of time today to do that. So with that, the book is available through Pacific Northwest Publishing. My contact information is there if you want to shoot me an email or have more, you know, specific questions. I did a pretty quick overview of the whole intervention, and you know, I'm sorry if I didn't cover everything. It was just kind of our timing today, but I'm happy to stay on the line if there are questions or there are things you want to ask.
Thanks, Jason. We appreciate you taking the time to introduce the content of the ADAPT book. Right at the moment, I don't see any questions, but if folks do have questions, this is a great time to ask them. You can enter them in the chat box or the Q&A box, and we'll keep an eye out for them. As Jason mentioned, the book is available through Pacific Northwest Publishing. Our website is pacificnwpublish.com. If you have any questions about ordering, you can reach out to us. If you have questions for Jason, you can reach out to him by email. Looks like Jason may have a question. Okay. Heather, the PowerPoint slides will be available when we post the webinar on our website. It'll take just a couple days to get all of that pulled together, and then we will send that information out via email to point you to access the recording, which you can share with other folks or review at your own convenience. Jason, I have a question about, is this an evidence-based curriculum? What settings work the best, school or community?
Yeah, so basically, yeah, so we built the curriculum off things that were in the research literature, and we've tested it as well, so yes. It works both, and we've tested it both in schools and the community. Which I didn't talk about today was the community-based studies that we've done. If you shoot me an email, I'm happy to send you those studies. We can talk about it in more detail. But we've used it in both. The other thing I didn't talk about today is kind of when you think back to the triangle that I presented. The middle of the triangle is the secondary kind of tier 2 stuff. The top of the triangle is tier 3. When I work in school settings, I'm usually in tier 2. When I work in community settings, I'm usually in tier 3. So I talk about secondary stuff or tier 2 stuff is usually prevention or intervention, and tier 3 is usually treatment. And we've done it both ways. In our treatment studies, the overlap between the content displayed in the book and our treatment studies is over 80% in terms of the intervention. And when I lecture and so forth, what I talk about is the reality is the interventions themselves are not all that different, but we have found good outcomes in both settings. So that's kind of anyway, quick answer, I guess, to your question.
No worries. We'll give it just another minute or two to see if there's additional questions that come in. It looks like we are wrapping up. There's another. What would the ideal person be to deliver this T2 intervention? I'm thinking of schools in particular.
Yeah, so we've done it. We've done it with school counselors. We've really, honestly, it's someone who has. We call them kind of school mental health professionals. If there is some training in terms of psychology or some type of background in mental health, I think that's probably optimal. But we've done it with a lot of different folks. So anybody like a school counselor, school social worker, and so forth. But we've also done it with, quote, more lay people. The work that we do right now in juvenile justice, we're actually doing work in the schools, and a lot of those folks are juvenile justice workers who do more community-based brief interventions. So it just kind of depends, honestly. The book is meant to be pretty straightforward so that it's written for professionals to take a look at and be able to kind of use the skills as they need. But that's kind of I guess my brief answer to that. So.
Okay. We have another question. How do you steer a student if you feel the triggers or other information they give you might not be the real picture?
Yes. Yeah, and that's, I could go on and on about that because we've had a lot of experience doing that. Part of the way we set up the whole intervention is it's really about getting them to buy into it. And it's really about setting a rationale and a purpose for the intervention and the students. And it's not about forcing them to do anything. It's about making the intervention their own. And what I didn't get to spend a lot of time on is kind of the setup, but in session 1, we do spend a lot of time kind of laying the groundwork and talking about how the intervention is their intervention, is not necessarily our intervention, and really connecting with what goals they want to come up through the intervention and so forth. The other piece of that is just to say our experience working in group settings is even if the student doesn't want to see some of those things that are coming up, one of the power of working in the group is other students will. So even the example that I gave about the decision-making chains where the student told me it just happened and he didn't know why it happened, I remember in that specific session, and this has happened many times, where other students rolled their eyes and said, sure, you don't know why it happened, and so forth. But remember what I said about the peers. Peers are really powerful, so a lot of times other students can hear that from peers more readily than they're going to hear that from adults. So anyway, so that's kind of my quick, again, a quick answer to that one. But yeah, that's a common issue that comes up.
All right, any more questions out there? All right, Jason, again, we appreciate you taking the time to do this webinar for us today.
Of course. Thanks, Jackie. And thanks, everybody. I appreciate your time. I know you're all busy, so have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone. We'll follow up in a day or two with the information about accessing the archived webinar. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.